Welcome to this MintPress live stream. I'm your host, Robert Inlakesh. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Today's stream is going to be heavy on the analysis side as we get into why the ceasefire happened between Iran and the US, how it's currently collapsing. And then we'll move on to the war in Lebanon, the battlefield updates and updates from Gaza also. But before we begin this live stream and all the work we do at MintPress is supported by our members. We call on you to join us for as little as $5 per month on Patreon. We were banned on PayPal and GoFundMe and had our fundraisers taken down and targeted by the Israel lobby and an Israeli OnlyFans model. So we do need your support to keep MintPress alive so we can continue exposing the stories that the corporate media refuses to touch on. I'd also like to comment that we're an hour earlier starting up today. So usually we would start, and we said we start at 5 p.m. CST. We've decided to dial that back an hour, and I think that we'll be doing 4 p.m. CST going forward as well, just so everyone is aware. So there is a lot to cover. A lot happened since our stream last week, and we'll start to get into some of that. The first of which point that we're going to focus on is Donald Trump's judgment, because as everyone has probably heard, the ceasefire talks didn't go well. And now Donald Trump has imposed a blockade on Iran's blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. And on top of that, what he decided to do for some very strange reason is to attack the Pope and then post this image up of himself, which everyone who is, I suppose, rational saw this as him presenting himself as Jesus right after attacking the Pope. So this stirred a lot of chaos, and Donald Trump, amidst talking about how he's going to defeat Iran and take their enriched uranium away from them if they don't hand it over, which of course Iran is not going to simply hand over its highly enriched uranium and fulfill all the demands, which we'll get into in a moment, that the Trump administration is putting forth. But he got sidetracked by a question from a reporter that asked him about this very image, and this was his response.
That picture of yourself depicted as Jesus Christ?
Well, it wasn't depicted. It was me. I did post it, and I thought it was me as a doctor, and it had to do with Red Cross, as a Red Cross worker there, which we support. And only the fake news could come up with that one. So I just heard about it, and I said, how did they come up with that? It's supposed to be me as a doctor making people better, and I do make people better. I make people a lot better. As an example, the 11,000, I understand your husband's going through treatment.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
He's going through some very serious cancer treatment, so
yes, sir.
This goes a long way.
Yes, sir, it sure does.
Yeah.
So as you can see there, there's nothing that he can't put a spin on. And of course, he's been putting a massive spin on the negotiations, because the negotiations, which were originally set forth to take place, it happened on Saturday behind us now. There were 21 hours worth of negotiations that took place. And Iran had agreed to a temporary 2-week cessation of hostilities based upon the idea that the United States was going to accept its own 10-point proposal. So this 10-point proposal was pretty maximalist. And you know that this was the case, and that, you know, it being accepted as the basis for negotiations was pretty extreme, because the Israeli media had that very reaction themselves. If you look at the way that the Israeli media covered the ceasefire, this is an article which was written by Avi Ashkenazi. He's an Israeli journalist. This is from Ma'ariv. And this came right after the announcement of the cessation of hostilities between both sides. Now, we'll get into what happened after that, but this is his summary of what happened. This page is translated from Hebrew. He says, 41 days of fighting and 5,000 destroyed buildings ended in a crushing Iranian victory. Despite Khamenei's assassination, the regime survived. The nuclear weapons remained, and Hormuz became Tehran's ATM. Israel and the US emerged from the campaign with an agreement that is all strategic surrender. And that's very much what actually happened there, or at least that was what was being presented, is that if these 10 points, which included a withdrawal of US forces from the region, the compensation, so reparations paid to Iran, Iran having full sovereignty, in essence, over the Strait of Hormuz, all of the sanctions removed, a ceasefire on all fronts, on top of a range of other guarantees, including being able to keep its highly enriched uranium and continue its nuclear program and get guarantees that the war was not going to begin again. This was a total disaster, at least in terms of the optics for the Israelis. And so immediately, as this was allegedly agreed to by the United States, I became personally very skeptical. And my analysis was originally that this was a trick that was being played. And unfortunately, it appears that it could have been, yes, a trick, but at the same time, both sides benefited. And there's three major reasons why both sides appear to have accepted it. And the reason I say this is because if we pull up here what Iran is saying, and this is important. So Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, and by the way, when we hear from Abbas Araghchi, when we hear from Masoud Pezeshkian, who's the president of Iran, these are the reformist camp inside of Iran. And so historically, they've always favored negotiations with the West. They want to try and normalize relations with the United States. And the 2015 Iran nuclear deal was of their making. They pushed for it. And of course, since then, it's sort of been a catastrophe, both in terms of the way the United States, of course, everything is because the United States decided not to respect the deal. But it's been a catastrophe for Iran because the sanctions that were imposed upon the Islamic Republic were harsher than ever following this agreement, which the United States never fully implemented. And of course, Donald Trump trashed and threw away. And so when you see that the foreign minister is saying that the demands made were excessive, you know that they truly were actually excessive at this point, because typically the reformists in Iran are not those who are asking for the maximalist position. At least that has been the case historically. So getting back to this, because I think this is important, and a lot of people ask, why would Iran do this at this time? Iran was ahead in terms of its its war efforts, and the way that it was handling the war. So a lot of people were critical of why Iran did this. And the reason why is, from the Iranian perspective, I believe, they saw this as an opportunity to demonstrate to their allies like China, like Pakistan, and others, who, by the way, China has been under economic stress because of this closure of the Strait of Hormuz. It's not something that doesn't impact China at all. They had the opportunity, at one point, to demonstrate that they were willing to go to the negotiations. They weren't irrational, and they weren't willing to just simply turn away, because everything in this 10-point plan proposal that allegedly had been agreed to, if we are to believe the account of the Pakistani mediators, that they presented the right proposal to the Trump administration, they were getting everything they were asking for. So they went forth because of this reason. I also believe that another reason for them to take this is because a pause in the hostilities enables rearmament, and it enables them as well to take a little bit of a break. And taking a break from this sort of fighting could possibly benefit them. And so this is, from Iran's perspective, perhaps some of the reasons why they would have favored this. And if they could get any concessions from the United States and were able to make them bend the knee in any way, perhaps they saw that this was worth pursuing. Then there's the other side, because a lot of people have argued that Israel is the primary reason for collapsing the negotiations and collapsing the talks and the ceasefire. I take a slightly different approach. I believe that Israel must have been in some way on board with this, because when you look at what those demands were, I mean, this is almost too good to be true for the United States. This is strategic defeat for the United States. That's why I showed you that article a moment ago by the Israeli military analyst Avi Ashkenazi. And it wasn't just him, it was many others, including former senior officials in the Israeli government, that were commenting on this, that this would have meant strategic defeat if Iran was to get its way in these negotiations. So I take the stance that Israel knew all along. And if we, before I get into the reasons why they perhaps did this and allowed it to happen, and why they were trying to trick the Iranian side, I think it's worth playing this video because it demonstrates that Netanyahu was openly talking to J.D. Vance during the 21 hours worth of negotiations. And it really does present the question, why did Netanyahu know what was happening in the room during the negotiations between the Iranians and the Americans? How was it kept up to date? And then why would that be in the US's strategic interest? So here's this clip of Netanyahu, which is dubbed into English.
Spoke yesterday with Vice President J.D. Vance. He called me from his plane on the way back from Washington. He reported to me in detail, as the people of this administration do every day, on the development of the negotiations. In this case, the explosion in the negotiations, the explosion came from the American side, which was not willing to tolerate the blatant violation of the agreement to enter negotiations by Iran. Essentially, the agreement was that there would be a ceasefire and Iran would immediately open the crossings. They didn't do that. The Americans were not willing to accept it. He also conveyed to me that the central issue on the table from the perspective of President Trump and the United States is the removal of all enriched material and ensuring that there is no more enrichment in the coming years, and this could be for decades.
So, having seen that and understanding that Netanyahu was participating essentially in these talks in a way, because his opinion was heard and communicated to the Vice President of the United States before the negotiations collapsed. We have to look at it in terms of what the Israelis and the Americans want. Well, the fighting was, of course, intense. They were using their air force around the clock. They get a break. They get to transport more weapons into the region, as we've seen them do. And they could be preparing for a ground assault, either on some islands like Abu Musa, or even Qashim Island, or perhaps Kharg Island, as others have argued, in Iran. Or they just could simply want a break and to rearm, and this could give them the ability to do that. The other reason, I believe, is that the Israelis wanted to focus the power of their air force onto Lebanon. And this was something that I had noted as the ceasefire was agreed to, that they were probably going to do. And unfortunately, that's exactly what happened. And Israel, within the space of 10 minutes, bombed around 100 different targets, they say belonging to Hezbollah, but these were civilian targets, in addition to trying to target the Secretary General of Hezbollah. But they didn't get him. They failed. They killed his secretary instead, and a bodyguard, I believe. Now, that is one of the reasons, in my opinion, that the Israelis were okay with this. They got to focus their air force on Lebanon, which they hadn't been able to do, especially as the fighting has been pretty intense on the ground in southern Lebanon, and the Israelis have been struggling to advance, which we'll get into in a little bit. But another objective aside from that, and I believe it really failed because they didn't get Naim Qassem. If they had killed the Secretary General, the leader of Hezbollah, I think this would have been a big blow that would have been dealt, and therefore they would have got their way and they would have been able to pull off this little diplomatic trick. And the reason, again, why I'm calling it a trick is because it's clear that the United States, from the get-go, the day after, we heard from the spokeswoman, the White House spokeswoman, that the United States, Trump had himself thrown the 10-point plan in the garbage. And we saw that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was openly speaking about the fact that the war is still ongoing, it's not over, and that this is a lull. And the Israeli media, I was following the Hebrew media and what they were commenting on it. And what they seemed to have been saying at the time was that, well, in 1948, they took it back to 1948 with the creation of what's now called Israel. There were a number of truces, and Israel got to use those truces, and they were just temporary, which is funny as an admission because they always claim that they were attacked. And it's true. Back in 1948, the Israelis, there were 2 truces that were imposed. Both of them they violated during the truces. One to attack Ramle and Lid, which is where near where Ben Gurion Airport is today. Another one, and they violated the truce a 3rd time, and used that truce as an excuse to set up and prepare themselves for another offensive, right? So then they used the truce to go and invade and take the Galilee and to take the Naqab or the Negev desert area. They simply weaponized truces. And this was what the Israeli media was openly talking about, is that this situation here could be compared to this as well. So the 3rd reason why the Israelis and the Americans perhaps accepted this is because also, if they could get these negotiations going, perhaps they believed what they could do is they could separate the different fronts. And so if they had succeeded at doing that, now Iran did not immediately respond to the killing over 300 people in Beirut in the large-scale massacre that the Israelis committed immediately. But the Iranians didn't agree to separate the fronts and to separate a ceasefire for themselves from a ceasefire from Lebanon. But if they would have managed to do that, and they managed to stir up a lot of chaos about this as well, and many people were doubting Iran and doubting whether it would take an unconditional ceasefire for itself, or maybe even a conditional ceasefire for itself, and then leave out Lebanon. And if they were able to separate the fronts, that weakens Iran in the war going forward. Because again, it's very clear that there was no intention of actually reaching a deal here, because the Americans were incapable of implementing any of Iran's 10 points. They didn't offer any of them. The Israelis said that they'll pause strikes on Beirut alone during the period of negotiations. And so what did they do? They just focused their air power in the south and killed around 100 people that day. In total now, they've killed around 2,100 people in Lebanon. That's what the Israelis have committed. So I do believe that this was trickery on their side, but I also do believe that there is stress that is placed upon the Iranian side as well, in terms of its allies demonstrating that it is able to engage in talks. Also internally, there is pressure because there are different camps with different ideas who would debate whether they should go to negotiations or not inside of Iran itself. And so they've now demonstrated that, and they've been able to take a break to also recalibrate and to rearm themselves. And I don't believe that this was in any way, shape, or form genuine. But if you are to read the mainstream corporate media, Donald Trump's recent move in reaction to the collapse of the negotiations was to impose a blockade on Iran's blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. And now this is important because the Wall Street Journal here is like, oh, you know, how could it work? And the answer to that is it can't work because it's a ridiculous concept to begin with. You can't blockade a blockade and then call that a victory. All they're going to do now is to stop the few tankers that were either affiliated with Iran or its allies from passing through the Strait of Hormuz. So if they do that, if they do choose to engage in that way, number one, if they hit Iranian ships, then we go back to full-scale war. That's very clear according to the Iranian military. They've put out statements saying just that. But also the big problem here is what happens if Chinese vessels attempt, and we've heard announcements from Beijing today that they will not respect Trump's blockade. What happens if they strike Chinese ships? What happens if they strike Russian ships, etc.? Are they going to pick wars on other fronts now because of the arrogance of the Trump administration? I mean, how is this actually implemented? And I mean, that's a very serious question here. It doesn't seem like it's going to work. I mean, the Trump administration, in a desperate plea to get the prices of oil down, enabled the Iranians to begin selling oil. It lifted some very specific sanctions so that some oil could be sold from the Iranian side. And it even lifted sanctions on Russia, which again goes against its strategic goals. But now it's saying that it wants to somehow blockade an already imposed blockade, which doesn't work to the benefit of their allies in the Persian Gulf. In fact, it makes it worse for them. And it makes Iran less likely to let anything pass at all. And we know that Iran is not simply going to give up. And we hear from the Trump administration, oh, it's going to open by itself, then we're going to open it, or we're going to invade an island, and our NATO allies are going to help us, then NATO is not going to help us, and we don't need NATO, but I'm going to punish NATO because, and so on. These ridiculous explanations which are given to the Trump administration's lack of a plan to explain it. And so if we look at what is currently going on, it's very clear that the Lebanon front has not stopped whatsoever. I want to play this video here because this is the current Secretary General of Lebanese Hezbollah. Before we play the Hezbollah videos, we always give the disclaimer that this is not an endorsement. This is for the public's knowledge. So I want to play this clip of the Secretary General, Sheikh Naim Qassem, who was speaking today about the prospect of a ceasefire in Lebanon being imposed and going back to the old situation prior to the war, which I'll go into a little bit more detail about.
تسلم وسندع الميدان يتكلم أما ألسنتنا فستكون مشغولة بذكر الله تعالى. نحن نرفض المفاوضات مع الكيان الإسرائيلي الغاصب. هذه المفاوضات عبثية، وهذه المفاوضات تحتاج إلى أن يكون هناك اتفاق وإجماع لبناني على تغيير البوصلة من عدم التفاوض إلى التفاوض المباشر كما يطرح الآن. لا يحق لأحد أن يأخذ لبنان إلى هذا المسار من دون توافق داخلي لمكوناته، وهذا لم يحصل. هذا جزء من التنازل من سلسلة التنازلات المجانية التي قدمتها السلطة، وتبين بالدليل العملي والواقعي أنها تنازلات خاسرة، بل يذلوننا بها كأعداء، وتخسر حكومة لبنان وشعب لبنان ومستقبل لبنان.
So what's very clear here is that Hezbollah, which is doing the fighting on the ground against the Israelis, is not looking for a ceasefire in any way, shape, or form. It is looking to defend Lebanese territory. That's what it is openly stating. Meanwhile, what's happening is that there is a conspiracy that is being played out by the Israeli side where they're seeking to incite civil war inside of Lebanon. They want to divide the population, and they want to use the government, the US-backed government, which is led by Prime Minister Nawaf Salam, who is a US pick, and Joseph Aoun, who's also a US pick for his position in Lebanon. They want to use this government to implement a solution over the top of the current predicament in Lebanon, which is, of course, that the Israelis have been busy blasting Lebanon, destroying the capital city. And as I just mentioned a few moments ago, in 10 minutes, they killed around 300 people in the Lebanese capital. And yet, what's happening here is the Lebanese government has begged, and this is very key here, the US has pressured the Lebanese government, and Israel, of course, has pressured them to beg for a cessation of hostilities. But not only that, for direct talks with the Israelis, which has never happened before. There's never been direct talks between the Israeli government and the Lebanese government. They are technically at a state of war, and Lebanon does not recognize Israel. So, at a time when 2,100 Lebanese have been slaughtered by Israel, ambulances have been targeted, journalists have been targeted, government buildings targeted, hospitals targeted, and this is ongoing on a daily basis. They're destroying entire towns in the south of the country, and it gets worse than that. The Israelis want to take all the way up to what's called the Litani River in South Lebanon, and you already have settler organizations who are openly calling for building new settlements throughout the south of Lebanon, to go all the way up to the Litani River here and seize this territory and annex it, and this become part of what is called Greater Israel. That's what they're proposing. Openly, Israeli officials are saying that the Lebanese public will not be allowed to return back to their homes if they live south of the Litani River. They've blown up all the bridges connecting the rest of Lebanon to the south of Lebanon. It's a mass ethnic cleansing campaign. And at the same time as this is happening, the US-backed government of Lebanon has completely sold out this population. That is how the people in the south feel, and they continue to feel, and they felt during the war, and this is not something new, by the way, that they feel like they've been sold out. This is something that's been going on for decades and decades and decades. So I'm going to show you a video back here. This is from during the occupation of South Lebanon, because Israel did used to occupy South Lebanon. And this clip here, I think, is very important context for people to see.
Coming to help us. We have no bread, no food, not even water, no electricity, nothing. We are alone. We have nothing. We need everything, you see. We are in south of Lebanon alone. And we have no fucking government.
Southern Lebanon was left to fend for itself.
See, the conditions that led to Hezbollah, which everyone now tries to blame for the current predicament of Lebanon, which is just utterly ridiculous. The reason why Hezbollah came into existence is because in 1982, the Israelis invaded Lebanon. They invaded all the way up and they imposed a siege on Beirut. And they killed around 20,000 Palestinians and Lebanese. And when they did this, eventually the PLO, which was fighting them at the time, by the way, this was a war of aggression, a war of choice by the Israelis. The Palestinian Liberation Organization, headed by Yasser Arafat, had attempted to wage what Israeli officials had called at the time a peace offensive, which meant that they were trying to push forward. And this was real. There was a multiple point plan put forth for the Saudis. They wanted to try and seek a two-state settlement, and the early phases of the initiative to do that were already coming to fruition, which many Palestinians opposed, putting that aside for a moment. Anyway, the Palestinian side was not aggressing. So what Israel did is it used the assassination or the attempted assassination of an Israeli in Europe to justify an invasion of Lebanon. And when it invaded Lebanon and eventually besieged Beirut, the PLO decided to hand over its weapons, because Israel said, if you hand over your weapons, the war stops, the oppression ends, the fighting ends, the death and the destruction ends, and there doesn't need to be any more bloodshed. So the PLO, its leadership relocated to Tunisia, and it gave over its weapons. And immediately after it gave over its weapons, it handed over its weapons, or a part of them, and it decided to flee to North Africa. The Israelis used their fascist militia allies in Lebanon to inflict massacres on the Palestinian refugee population. The most infamous massacre was Sabra and Shatila, but also the Shia population of the south. And so this is important context because, as I said, this stream is going to be a bit heavy on the analysis side this time around. But this is important context because I believe people should understand where Hezbollah came from. The Shia population of South Lebanon, which was always a lot more poor, it's normal that this happens. You know, the major cities is where a lot of the wealth is concentrated, but they were a lot poorer. They had the ML movement, of course, but in general, they weren't actually all that opposed to the Israelis back in the 70s and the very early 80s. Some of them, they simply wanted the PLO to leave Lebanon because they felt that a state inside of a state had been created. Not all of the people of the South believed this, but this was a portion of the population that lived there. And so they weren't actually particularly the most hostile group in Lebanon to the Israelis. But then the Israelis decided that they're going to stay inside Lebanon, that they would impose a security zone inside of Lebanon and occupy them and oppress them. And so born out of that was Hezbollah. Officially, it announced itself in 1985, fighting against the Israeli occupiers. That's why it was created. That's why they fought against them. And it took them all the way until the year 2000 to expel the Israeli occupiers from their country. Now, Israel wants to do it all over again. And again, its excuses are the same thing. Like the PLO were hiding in tunnels and firing their rockets and causing all the problems in Lebanon. Hezbollah is now causing the problems. Hezbollah is the reason for all of the issues. When there was a ceasefire imposed between 2006 and 2023, which largely held, other than the Israelis, of course, with their drones and boats and occasionally their soldiers going over and trying to extend how far their security fence and wall extended into Lebanese territory. Largely it held. There was no large-scale fighting that took place between both sides for a very long time because Hezbollah managed to expel the Israelis from the country. Now that's what happened. And so the Israelis, when the ceasefire was imposed in 2024, November 2024, they violated the ceasefire over a period of 15 months, 15,400 times. They killed 370 plus people in Lebanon, again, targeting civilians on a near daily basis. They were bombing all over South Lebanon. The war didn't really stop for South Lebanon. And that's why the people feel as if they have been abandoned. And so, again, to pull this up here, the Lebanese government was supposed to be negotiating for a ceasefire in Lebanon. But then the Israeli ambassador to the US said in a statement that Israel had not agreed to a ceasefire, to discuss a ceasefire with Hezbollah. Instead, it agreed only to promote a peace agreement, so normalization. So it wants Israel wants to negotiate for a normalization agreement with Lebanon without having a ceasefire. And guess what? In order to get this, the Lebanese government suggested that the Israelis go back to the understandings of November 2024 and conduct strikes only against imminent threats from Hezbollah. And of course, this is ridiculous in of itself, the imminent threats here. And there are countless examples of this not being the case. In fact, the Israelis throughout this ceasefire, this 15-month ceasefire period, were using chemical warfare in the south of Lebanon. They were expanding. Originally, they had 5 points in the south of the country. They expanded that to 7 points in the south of the country. And they were openly saying, we're never going to leave Lebanese territory. But the Lebanese government wants to do direct talks with them for a normalization agreement, for peace, without a ceasefire. And then they're just proposing that we don't have a real ceasefire. We go back to the understanding where you keep bombing, but it's not so bad. It's not as heavy as it is right now. And so Hezbollah, in response, has said, no, we're not going to agree to any ceasefire of the sort. We're going to keep fighting. That's the predicament right now in Lebanon. And I think something that's important to show everyone here is that the Israelis are clearly showing that they don't want to leave. This is Benjamin Netanyahu saying that, now he claims, and the Israelis claim, that this happened, this meeting or this stunt occurred in the south of Lebanon. Others have indicated that actually this was at an Israeli military position in the north. It wasn't actually in South Lebanon, and that he was lying about that, obviously for his security situation. But they intended people to believe that he was in South Lebanon. And this is happening days away from normalization talks, direct talks with the Lebanese government. And so people have been packing the streets. That's what's been happening in reaction to this. Because openly, the Lebanese government is just wanting to submit. They don't care at all. So having pulled this up, one of the major developments on the ground that's happening now with Hezbollah and its fight against the Israelis is a battle that's been taking place to capture what's known as Bint Jbil. Bint Jbil is a village in the south of Lebanon, which holds a lot of historic and symbolic importance. So the Israelis have been pushing hard to capture it and have so far failed to do so, but they've encircled it, and Hezbollah is holding out. Now, in 2006, it was a major battle that took place for Bint Jbil, and the Israelis had attempted to capture it. And the significance of this village in of itself goes beyond just 2006. It goes all the way back to the year 2000, when Hezbollah succeeded at liberating South Lebanon and the Israeli occupation withdrew from South Lebanon. And so Israel went ahead and bombed a soccer football stadium in Bint Jbil, where Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, the former Secretary General of Hezbollah, delivered a very famous speech where and I'll play it in a moment because it is significant to watch, and there's some content in there, and it sort of builds the symbolic importance of the area. But they bombed this site, which there's nothing there. They just bombed it because the Israelis believe that this is an insult to Hezbollah, and this is of some sort of importance to them to do this. And so entering this area is something that they're desperately trying to achieve, and so far they have failed. And so I'll pull this up on a map to show you just how much of a failure this has been. So just add this here. 1 second. Remove this. So this is the village in question. So it's located, as you can see, not too far from the border with northern occupied Palestine. But the Israelis have besieged it, and taking it is of strategic importance to them because it symbolizes, a victory over Hezbollah after they managed to hold it in the south. And some other areas that they've been fighting to take is here at Taibeh. There's been a lot of battles here. And as you can see, this is just miles away from the border. They haven't got far, and they're still failing after more than 40 days to capture these areas fully and take them. Like Khiyam is another one that they've failed. They haven't fully captured Khiyam yet. And again, this is not actually far when you look here, because this is the newly imposed territory that the Israelis are in. after having seized more of Syria. But back in 2006, within 30 days, they reached the Litani River, which runs along here. You can see this territory here. They reached the Litani River within 30 days. Now they're failing, not only like in 2006, Hezbollah managed to hold Bint Jbeil, but they're failing to take any areas and to advance further than a few miles into Lebanese territory, which is, of course, very significant because their failure to do so shows that militarily on the ground, the Israelis are incapable of fighting. I mean, they have been waging this war now for over 40 days on the ground, and they've managed to not even pass a few miles, really, in most areas. And every time they try to advance in a significant way, Hezbollah are confronting them and are defeating their advances. And we're seeing this time and time again. And the Israelis on their side, what they're saying about these villages, and this is very significant. This is an Israeli spokeswoman who just said this. Take a listen to what she says about these villages and how she describes them.
Minister Netanyahu visited our heroic soldiers in southern Lebanon just yesterday within the security zone. Our forces are pushing Hezbollah away from the border and dealing with the terrorist villages that are adjacent to us on our northern border, while also defending our border at all times.
Terrorist villages, so entire villages are terrorists, apparently, which is the exact same way that the Israelis would address the Palestinians. And when they would take more Palestinian territory in Gaza, they would speak about Gaza in the exact same way. We took over a terrorist headquarters, which was a hospital or a UN school. And so, like I said, I'm going to play this clip here. And this is of the former Secretary General. And this is a very famous speech. It's translated here into English, where Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah delivered his speech. And you might hear this be passed around, that Israel is a spider's web. That's where this phrase came from, that Israel is a spider's web. It's as weak as a spider's web. And Israel didn't like that and has still not gotten over it. This speech took place in 2000. So we're talking over 2 decades now that the Israelis have been trying to capture Bint Jbeil, to punish it. They bombed the site where this speech was delivered. And another interesting note on the history of Bint Jbeil: when Iranian President Ahmadinejad visited Lebanon, he actually gave a speech from this location in 2008 as well. But this is the speech, and this is why Israel wants to capture this village and is so focused on it. And its big objective is to put an Israeli flag at the location where Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah delivered this speech.
شعوب أمتنا العربية والإسلامية، ومن هنا من بنت جبيل المحررة أخاطب شعب فلسطين المظلوم المعذب المضطهد. يا شعبنا في فلسطين، مصيرك بيدك، مصيرك بيدك. أرضك تستطيع أن تستعيدها بإرادتك، بخيار عز الدين القسام.
Just a note here, Izz ad-Din al-Qassam was a Syrian who fought in the 1940s and was killed, and is sort of the founding father of the resistance inside of Palestine. So the Qassam brigades of Hamas is named after him. And there is a lot of references back to him and his struggle, which was centered around Jenin. And what he did is he recruited workers to form a resistance against the British and the Zionists before Israel came into existence. So I think I said the year wrong. He was killed in before the Arab Revolt, it's called, the 1936 Arab revolt. He was killed a year prior to that. And so everyone is aware of that's who he's referencing there. And he's also talking as well about Fathi Shaqaqi, who is the founder of Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and as well Yahya Ayash, as well, who's another very significant figure in the history of Palestinian resistance. But I just thought I'd note that there so you know who he's talking about.
دماء فتح الشقاقي ويحيى عياش يمكنك أن تستعيد أرضك دون أن يمن عليك هذا الصهيوني بزاروب هنا أو قرية هناك. يمكنكم أن تعيدوا أهلكم إلى ديارهم بفخر واعتزاز دون توسل لأحد. أنتم تستطيعون أن تستعيدوا أرضكم وحقوقكم المشروعة حتى ولو تخلى عنكم كل العالم. دعوا هذه الأدلة والحجج جانبا. إن طريق فلسطين يا شعب فلسطين، إن طريقكم إلى الحرية هو طريق المقاومة والانتفاضة، المقاومة الجادة والانتفاضة الحقيقية. ليس الانتفاضة في إطار أوسلو، وليس الانتفاضة في خدمة المفاوض المتنازل في ستوكهولم. الانتفاضة والمقاومة الذي لا ترضى إلا بالحق كاملا، كما في لبنان. في لبنان كل لبنان يرفض أن يبقى جزء بسيط من أرضه تحت الاحتلال. هذا النموذج اللبناني الراقي نقدمه لشعبنا في فلسطين. نعم، أنتم الفلسطينيون المظلومون، أنتم الفلسطينيون العزل، أنتم الفلسطينيون المحاصرون. يمكنكم أن تفرضوا على الغزاة الصهاينة أن يعودوا من حيث أتوا. فليذهب الفلاشة إلى أثيوبيا. هلا أرض واسعة بأثيوبيا في محلات منيح. فليعد اليهود الروس إلى روسيا. على كل الخيار عندكم والنموذج ماثل أمام أعينكم. المقاومة الصادقة والجادة يمكنها أن تصنع لكم فجر الحرية يا إخواننا وأحباءنا وأعزائنا في فلسطين. أقول لكم يا شعبنا في فلسطين إن إسرائيل هذه التي تملك أسلحة نووية وأقوى سلاح جو في المنطقة والله هي أوهن من بيت العنكبوت. والله هي أوهن من بيت العنكبوت. لكن إذا كنتم تريدون.
So I'll just stop that there because it goes on for some time. But the significance of the speech is that the Israelis really took this to heart, because after the Israelis had withdrawn their forces from Lebanon and given up their occupation of Lebanese territory, this speech was then delivered addressing the Palestinian people and telling them that you need to go and do the same thing as what we've done here inside of Lebanon, that you need to expel the occupiers through armed resistance. So in 2006, this was the site where Israel tried to reach, and they wanted to take Bint Jabir because of this very speech and the concept that Israel is like a spider's web. And this is something that has stuck with the Israelis and that they've not been able to get over, and they're obsessed with. And so there is this massive battle that's ongoing, and the Israelis keep getting driven back. They keep trying to advance, and Hezbollah keeps on striking their military vehicles and forcing them to withdraw time and time again. Now, what is likely to happen in the long term, if this continues to go on for a very long time, is that the Israelis will be drawn very deep into South Lebanon. So we should expect them to go deep into Lebanese territory. And the idea there would be for Hezbollah and the other forces, because it's not just Hezbollah that's on the ground, it's many Palestinian groups as well that operate inside of Lebanon that would come to the aid of Hezbollah as well in this fight, that they'd then be able to sort of drown them deep inside Lebanese territory. So the idea is to drag them in, to draw them in, to take out their tanks and their armored personnel carriers and make them come on foot, make them come on the ground, don't allow them to hide, so that they can inflict massive casualties on them and then force them from the country altogether through inflicting maximum casualties on the invading army. So that's the strategy that's being developed. And it's important to consider this because Hezbollah is not stopping anytime soon, according to its rhetoric. It's not about to just accept going back to the old reality. And at this current time, the Israelis do have the ability to focus their air force on Lebanon. But if the war is to return soon between Iran and the United States, which it's expected to do so, even if there is another round of negotiations, it just doesn't seem like it's plausible that anything will come of it. If that is going to happen, then they're going to be preoccupied. But if there was any chance that somehow an agreement was going to come with Iran, and I don't believe there is, but let's say there is an agreement and Iran accepted a ceasefire and it didn't include Lebanon, or even maybe if it did include Lebanon, but I don't believe the Israelis would withdraw, then what might end up happening is we may see the Israelis advance on another front, and that is, unfortunately, in Gaza, because a lot of people have missed this, but the Israelis had given a 60-day deadline to Hamas and the other Palestinian groups to disarm, to hand over their weapons in Gaza as part of the so-called phase 2 of the ceasefire agreement. And this ceasefire agreement is one in which over 700 Palestinians have been killed. The Israelis have committed at least 3,000 violations of the ceasefire, but they wanted Hamas to disarm before they allow even, proper materials to come in so that Palestinians can live in anything more than tents. The vast majority of the Palestinians in Gaza don't live in they don't have real shelter. So they didn't allow anything. And in the meantime, what they've been doing is they've armed and trained and continue to build on 5 different groups, which are linked to ISIS, to fight against the Palestinians. This is a militant force, a series of death squads that the Israelis have invested in, armed, trained, and who they direct as well. They give them orders to attack the Palestinian people. And about a week ago, these ISIS-linked death squads attempted to kidnap women and children in Al-Burej refugee camp in Gaza. And it looks like perhaps what the Israelis are going to do currently is try and use these groups in order to attack Palestinians in Gaza after Hamas has, of course, rejected the idea of disarmament, because there's no guarantees that if you disarm, what are the Israelis going to do? Maybe they will just come in and try to ethnically cleanse everybody. There's no reconstruction. The aid that's coming in is not up to standard. And then you have, and this is why I pulled this article up here, then you have the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, which, along with the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, these are like the 2 big Zionist think tanks based in Washington, D.C. that helped drive and really lobby, or not say lobby, but push the Bush administration into the Iraq War. Now it's advocating for Donald Trump's so-called Board of Peace not to yield to Hamas and to push back on disarmament. Washington should continue to support both preventative and reactive Israeli strikes across Gaza for as long as Hamas continues to comply with disarmament demands to ensure the group cannot reconstitute its military capabilities. In parallel, reconstruction planning should advance rapidly in all parts of Gaza outside of Hamas's control. Now, this is a key part, outside of Hamas's control. So who lives in this territory outside of the control of Hamas in Gaza? There's a few thousand people who are the members of the ISIS-linked death squads in Gaza, who used to be controlled by Yasser Abu Shabab until he got killed. and their families. They're the people. The rest of the population of Gaza are not living outside of Hamas-controlled areas. So they're talking about reconstruction planning should rapidly advance in only the areas outside of Hamas's control, which is 60% of the Gaza Strip. It was supposed to be 56, but of course, the Israelis violated what's called the yellow line, and they seized more territory than the ceasefire allowed for. But the Foundation for Defense of Democracies is advocating for a new bombing campaign, which would mean the collapse of the ceasefire altogether. It's living in a delusional world if it thinks that it should, if Israel reactivated strikes across Gaza, that nothing would happen and the ceasefire would remain. So the reason why I'm bringing this up now is that 60-day deadline has now expired. And at this current moment, the Israelis don't look like they want to go ahead and do what the Foundation for Defense of Democracies is advocating here, because if they have to fight Gaza, fight Lebanon, and fight Iran at the same time, this might prove a little bit tricky for them. So they would rather do this at another point, which brings me to this. Okay, the so-called ceasefire that was imposed in Gaza, we heard that it's supervised internationally by the Board of Peace. And the other thing is the CMCC, the Civil Military Coordination Council, or Center, right, which is based in Kiryat Gat. Now, this is composed of around 20 different nations and is supposed to be under the authority of CENTCOM. So it's supposed to be under the control of the United States military. And yet Israel bars Spanish presence at Gaza ceasefire HQ in Kiryat Gat. Again, CENTCOM apparently has nothing to say about this because Israel is making decisions over the CMCC, which supposedly the United States controls, which again, the United States doesn't control anything. Nothing when it comes to its foreign policy. It just doesn't control anything. It doesn't seem like it makes any of its own decisions. It doesn't have a say on anything that it does. Because look at how CENTCOM gets slapped around. Israel doesn't want Spain because Spain has been criticizing Israel. Well, it's supposed to be the Civil Military Coordination Center, which is designed to keep the ceasefire together. So the whole purpose of 20 plus countries being part of the Civil Military Coordination Center is that they monitor the ceasefire for ceasefire violations. And one country, not Egypt, not Morocco, not any of these Arab Gulf states that are part of it, Spain calls it out, calls the Israelis out, and starts criticizing them. It does what this CMCC is supposedly there for, right? To scrutinize Israel and to point out ceasefire violations, and suddenly the one that starts doing that is kicked out. So it's a big show. There's no CMCC. It's just a bunch of countries which they believe it makes them relevant to participate in a viewing room, a monitoring center to monitor the slaughter of over 700 Palestinians in Gaza. That's what's happened. That's what's happened. Over 20 countries which claim to be caring about the Palestinian people and the ceasefire in Gaza, have sat around and watched on these big monitors as Israel shoots with sniper rifles children, while Israel bombs densely populated tent cities of the displaced. They've sat around and watched it. And then it turns out that the CENTCOM, U.S. Central Command, it doesn't have any control over the CMCC, which it's supposed to control. So I think it speaks volumes that the Israelis were able to kick out Spain. And the Israelis were also able to kick out humanitarian organizations from the CMCC. Because you start criticizing Israel and criticizing their violations of the ceasefire, then suddenly you get kicked out. Which again, the CMCC is a joke. It's not actually built to monitor the ceasefire and have it enforced. The ceasefire in of itself was not a ceasefire. It's the Israeli military taking a break and trying to implement a scheme with ISIS-backed militias inside of the country. And they still don't know what to do with Gaza. They're just letting the people linger there. And then the so-called Board of Peace, which was passed through UN resolution, 3602? I can't even remember the specific resolution now that it was. It's been a while. But back in November of 2025, the United Nations Security Council voted on the resolution, a Security Council resolution to allow for the Board of Peace to be created. And the Board of Peace was supposed to be created for the Gaza Strip. Now, this resolution, what it did is it discarded decades and decades of international law, of precedents set in the Security Council and the General Assembly. And it was the death certificate of the United Nations. And it birthed the Board of Peace, which in its official charter doesn't even mention Gaza or Palestine. So again, the Israelis are sitting around, and this is a key point, and I think I'll sort of close on this subject when it comes to ceasefires on all fronts. The Israelis do not see a ceasefire unless it's forced upon them and that they are physically beaten or economically forced to. They don't see a ceasefire as a means of, well, we need to actually cease fire and we need to, perhaps work towards a diplomatic solution. They see a ceasefire as an opportunity for another attack. That's what we saw in Lebanon with 15,400 violations of the ceasefire, which was imposed in November 27 of 2024. The most ceasefire violations ever committed in human history. There's never been, that is the world record for most ceasefire violations. In Gaza, at least 3,000 ceasefire violations. Every single Gaza ceasefire that they agreed to prior to the October 7, 2023 genocide, every single one they violated. They violated all of their ceasefire. The only time that they didn't initiate a conflict through violating a ceasefire was perhaps in 1973, when Egypt and Syria launched an offensive to recapture occupied territories, the Sinai Peninsula, because we should remember this, that Israel occupied Egypt and occupied Syria as well a long time ago. So the Egyptians and the Syrians attempted to retake their land in 1973. Other than that, every single other conflict, they've used ceasefires as an opportunity to launch another offensive. And the same would be the case here. And this is why Iran most likely will never take such a ceasefire, because Israel hasn't been militarily defeated yet. It hasn't been dealt a blow which would deter it yet. And so Iran accepting a ceasefire with the Israelis, what this would mean is one thing. The Israelis would go back to the drawing board and we would see another war of aggression where they would start by assassinating maybe Mujtaba Khamenei in 6 months to a year, perhaps maybe a few years, because they feel like it was too intense this time to do it every single year. But the Israelis will be back and they'll fight again, and they'll use the ceasefire as a means of going back to the drawing board. That's all they're going to do. And they'll focus their attention on Lebanon, and then they'll use Gaza as a punching bag if they want to, if they feel like they need to do that. And they don't have a solution anywhere. That's why Gaza, they froze the conflict, because they have no solution for Gaza. They don't know what they're doing. They have no idea what they're doing in Gaza. They don't have a plan for Gaza. All they've been able to do is literally just inflict massive death and destruction, and then they've frozen it because they're stuck. And then with Lebanon, they froze it after claiming to have dealt a big blow to Hezbollah, but they never did. They never did destroy Hezbollah, defeat Hezbollah, and drive them back from north of the Litani River. They never did that. And with the Iranians as well, all these military victories they claim to have achieved against Iran, taking out its navy, which they haven't, and destroying its air defenses, which obviously has not been the case, and destroying its launchers and all of its launchers and 90% of its missiles and all of the rest of these things that they claim are nonsense. We know that it's not true. And so if there is an agreement to pause hostilities, then what would happen is Iran has made maybe a short-term gain if it manages to get something, but in the long term, it's a strategic, I don't know if it's a strategic failure, but what it means is that you've just delayed the inevitable happening again. So you're back to square one, even if you manage to gain some things, even if Iran came out with an agreement where the United States decided to lift sanctions and allow the Strait of Hormuz to come under Iranian sovereignty, and they wouldn't interfere with that, right? A few of the points, at least, on the 10-point plan, the 10-point proposal. There's no guarantee that the Israelis are going to stop aggressing, and the reason why the war happened was Israel. Israel is the reason why the United States attacked Iran. And so if Israel is not defeated, then Israel will keep attacking, and Israel will keep making sure that its lobbies in Western countries are going to do what they need to do, specifically in the United States. And the Israelis do control the Trump administration's foreign policy. No other administration in the history of the United States has been so weak as to go and do everything Israel asks without considering whether this is strategically smart and that this will serve US, even the strategic objectives of the US empire. It doesn't seem like the US Trump administration even cares about that. That's why others, you'll see these hawks. Hillary Clinton just came out and said that she supported Trump bombing Iranian nuclear facilities last year, but doesn't support Trump's attack now. Why? Now, Hillary Clinton openly said that she wanted to attack Iran. So why would she not support this? Because it doesn't make any sense. And again, the Israelis are the ones that need to be defeated here. If the Israelis are not defeated, what will inevitably happen is that we're back to square one and the war is going to happen. Even if there's a ceasefire imposed, we're just kicking the can down the road and there's going to be another attack. That is the inevitable. So that is why Iran can't accept a ceasefire agreement at this point, because the Israelis immediately, when the 2-week ceasefire was declared, what did they do? They started screaming at their population that we haven't ended this campaign and the war is not over, and they started bombing Lebanon and killed 300 people inside 10 minutes. I mean, it's evident where this is going. It's obvious what the Israelis are up to here and that they are commanding this war. And so we shouldn't expect that even if there was a ceasefire, that the Israelis would respect it. It's not something that makes any sense for them to do. So on that note, I think that might be the way we should end this live stream. We want to do these live streams. I think from now on, we're going to be doing them at 4 p.m. CST. So for everybody watching right now, thank you for tuning in. Make sure you're hitting that like button, sharing this content. And if you want to see more, tune in next week. At the same time, we'll be live here to break down all of the developments.